Modern strength programs often have lifters work up to a heavy top set, then reduce the load to perform a few additional sets, probably better known as backoff sets. However, these backoff sets are sometimes programmed in a way that can be counterproductive, increasing the amount of fatigue accumulated without an increase in the stimulus for strength gain. In today's video, we'll discuss the principles underlying the best way to program backoff sets for strength. As we discussed on the channel before, the relative load or the percentage of 1RM used is the most predictive factor of strength gains, such that heavier loads result in greater improvements in 1RM strength. This relationship perfectly demonstrates why top sets have become so popular in modern strength programming. Frequent exposures to very heavy loads are a really efficient route to strength gains. A study by Androulakis, Kourakakis, and colleagues demonstrated that meaningful strength gains could be observed in well-trained powerlifters performing only 2, 3, or 1 heavy singles a week on the squat, bench press, and deadlift respectively. Now the obvious follow-up question is, why don't we perform all of our training this way? It's an obvious implication of load's predictive capacity on strength gains, but it comes down to two things. 1, unsustainability, and 2, volume accumulation. The first point is straightforward. In my experience, few lifters can physically or psychologically tolerate and sustain many sets performed with greater than 85% of 1RM. The second point is where backoff sets come into play. Since it's unrealistic to accumulate a meaningful amount of volume with only low rep sets, you may not be able to perform a sufficient number of repetitions to dial in technique or stimulate muscle growth, with both likely contributing to strength to some degree. Thus, a reduction in load, followed by a few more sets with a moderate repetition range, can make a meaningful impact. As a proof of concept, if we return to the study by Androulakis, Kourakakis, they compared a group performing only heavy singles to a group performing heavy singles plus 2 sets of 3 repetitions at 80% of the day's single. The group performing backoff sets had approximately 20 kilo greater improvement on their powerlifting total compared to the singles group, demonstrating the utility of backoff sets. To most effectively program backoff sets for strength, one must have a good understanding of the balance of fitness and fatigue. Because the heavy top sets within a lifter's program likely deliver the majority of the stimulus in the short to moderate term, our goal is to provide the cherry on top in regards to stimulus without derailing top set performance due to the additional fatigue accumulated. We can turn to the research to gain insight into the primary factors contributing to stimulus and fatigue respectively. As I discussed in our recent video discussing the various components of intensity, the factors that drive strength seem to be pretty clear. After load has been taken out of the equation, the predominant predictive factor related to strength gains, proximity to failure, doesn't seem to impact strength gains much at all. Moreover, moving a sub-maximal load with maximal intended velocity seems to result in better strength gains than if you were to deliberately slow the concentric portion of a repetition. All these factors point to force production as the best explanation of these findings. Thus, organizations of training variables that hurt our force production, i.e. fatigue, should be something we will likely avoid. Potentially the most useful proxy of fatigue we have is velocity loss. At a given load, the percentage intraset velocity loss will be directly related to the decline in force production. Interestingly, both decreasing the load and taking sets close to failure seem to increase the velocity loss of a set, which suggests that low loads and training closer to failure might not only cause more fatigue, but fail to provide an additional strength stimulus. Thus, the basic idea for backoff sets is we want to accumulate minimal velocity loss. This means training with as heavy a loads and as far from failure as one can logistically tolerate. Now, you may be saying, does this mean we're going to perform a bunch of cluster singles with 85% of our 1RM? That would take forever. Now, I can understand where that comes from, and I can make a compelling case for this, I think, but I think we can go a step further to make things a bit more logistically feasible. While the body of velocity loss research is limited due to not equating the total repetitions, gains in strength seem to be optimized around a 20% velocity loss threshold, with greater velocity loss harming strength gains. This may suggest that the window of 0 to 20% velocity loss does not result in sufficient fatigue to disrupt strength gain. From a practical perspective, we know that there's tons of variation in repetition capacity at a given velocity loss threshold. It will be dependent on the individual, the exercise, the set number, the load, and the list goes on and on. As a very crude metric, I think terminating sets in the range of 70 to 85% of 1RM with greater than 3 RER will be a solid place to start to equate to the velocity loss of interest. We know from other research the amount of repetitions individuals can perform at a given load is highly variable, thus the amount of repetitions an individual could perform prior to 3 RER or a 20% velocity loss threshold is also going to be highly individual. I actually think this variability could be a feature rather than a bug. In my coaching experience, some individuals seem to observe superior outcomes when accumulating more repetitions per set for strength. Now, this could have a variety of explanations, but it also could be that A, they require more volume, or B, they have a slower rate of fatigue such that they are not reaching a disadvantageous level of velocity loss within those sets. Now, this brings up the best way to integrate these principles to auto-regulate your back-off sets. A recent study by Inako and colleagues investigated the effects of something they coined the auto-regulation cluster training method, and they compared it to traditional and inter-repetition rest training. The point of this study that I think is worth highlighting is that the auto-regulation cluster training method was able to accumulate the same number of total repetitions at the same load with the same total rest with less velocity loss than the other two conditions. Each individual performed their first set to a 20% velocity loss threshold, then terminated that set after X repetitions. Then they would perform clusters of one less repetition until they either reached the total of 24 repetitions or they reached the 20% velocity loss threshold again, in which they would reduce the following set by another repetition, and they would just repeat that process. You can see how this can lead to highly individualized training prescriptions, allowing for those with greater endurance to perform more repetitions per set and those who fatigue more quickly to break up the work into more total sets. As a practical way to translate this concept into the gym, I like the following principles. The first step is to pick a back-off set load, for example, 75% of 1RM. The second is to pick a total number of repetitions that you want to perform, as an example, 24 repetitions. Then you're going to perform your first set to a 20% velocity loss threshold, or somewhere around 4 RAR if you don't have access to a velocity unit. Then you're going to perform sets of one less repetition than you initially achieved on the first set until you reach the same velocity loss or RAR target. Then you just repeat the process by taking another rep off those sets and keep going until you accumulate the target number of total repetitions. Now, if you reach a set where you perform only one repetition and exceed your velocity loss or RAR target, then you can just drop the load by 5% and keep rolling. I want to clarify a few things I'm not saying. Most of the data we have in this area is what I'd call short to moderate term. Basically, if you're looking to maximize strength within 4 to 16 weeks, that's where I lean on some of these strategies related to minimizing velocity loss of your back-off sets. The longer term we get, the more likely other variables such as hypertrophy are going to be a much larger contributor to strength gains, and because the training variables that matter most for those adaptations are basically reversed, as an example, load really doesn't seem to matter and training closer to failure is likely superior, this setup may not be ideal. Another thing is there's absolutely benefits of taking moderate load sets close to failure / high velocity loss, particularly when you're limited on time. A set like this will check a few boxes in a really time efficient manner, provide a solid hypertrophy stimulus, an opportunity to practice with slow repetition velocities, and expose the lifter to what it feels like to shift the loading demands throughout a set, or in simpler words, find a way to grind through a really hard repetition. Ultimately, if you're limited on time, taking a moderate load set close to failure might be the most efficient route you can do compared to the previously described top set plus back off approach. So by no means am I saying that's useless. Returning to the study by Androulakis Korakakis for the final time, they did another investigation where they compared a group performing a heavy single plus back-offs to a group only performing one set to approximately volitional failure with 70% of 1RM. The AMRAP group actually did pretty well with a 15.3 kilo increase in their total compared to a 26.8 kilo increase in the singles plus back-off group. In summary, back-off sets are a common part of modern strength programs. However, they can be approached in a counterproductive manner by increasing fatigue while failing to provide an additional strength stimulus. By minimizing velocity loss, we can avoid these common pitfalls while allowing for further individualization. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe, leave a like, and let us know what you want to see from us next in the comments below. And if you want more free content like this directly to your inbox, sign up for our newsletter, which is the first link below.